Welcome to another parent-teacher video lesson from the earlygiftedmanual.com, a free website for homeschooled children 3 to 7 years old and their parents that promotes and develops giftedness at an early age. I am Gary Blank, the creator of that site, and your host and facilitator for this video and all of the videos in my educational program. As the video lessons are designed to work in conjunction with the program on my website, I ask you to, at some point, click on the URL link in the description box below, and this action will take you to the earlygiftedmanual.com. By doing that, you will be able to put this lesson and all of the video lessons here on my channel in the proper context of the total program that I am presenting to you and your child. And welcome everyone to video lesson 46. And in this lesson, it's all about graphing. We will talk about how you can teach your child to graph information and to graph survey data. So before I get started here, though, I need to tell you that as you can hear, my voice is a little different today. I'm just getting over the cold, and my breathing isn't all that great, so hope you can put up with that through this lesson and maybe a couple more. So the materials you will need for this lesson are a graphing chart pad, and I have a pad of about 50 sheets that I got at the art supply store. It's 34 inches by 27 inches, so very big sheets with 1-inch squares, and you can see a piece of that right here. And what I've done is, what I always do when I make graphs is I just cut out whatever I need from the big sheet and use that. If you don't want to work big, you can go to the Early Gifted Manual. You can make a copy of this printable. It's called graph paper, 3/4 of an inch. That would work for the particular bar graph we're going to be doing in this lesson. Let's see, what else do we need here? Oh, I just wanted to say that however kids prefer the larger format, just because they like to be able to see things nice and big. This is something you could put up on the wall. So preferably try to do it in the larger format here, the 1-inch squares. But if not, you can always use for your convenience, just use a piece of smaller 8.5 by 11 graph paper like this. Okay, what else will you need? You'll need a pencil and some chart markers, and you might want to get various colors. I think some people like to have lots of different colors on their graphs, but you could, of course, do it with just any one color, so that's up to you. All right, so I think to start out, we need to simply ask the question, what is a graph? Well, a good adult definition would be that a graph is a diagram, and it represents what we call quantitative information, in other words, how many. So quantitative information and relationships. And how would you explain that to your child? Well, in language that he or she can understand. You could say that a graph gives a person a picture of information that answers the question how many, and how those quantities of things relate to each other. And of course, you can start out that way, but as you do the graph, of course, he or she will gain a greater understanding of exactly what all that means. And the real beauty of a graph is that it organizes information in a very easy to understand format. It creates a great picture for your child to understand the information. And like I said, as we get into it more here, you'll see, and your child will see exactly what we mean by that. So I think we could start, the best way to do this would just to create a fictional bar graph. And actually there are several kinds of graphs. A bar graph is just one of them. But that's what we'll be doing here in this lesson. And of course, a graph, just speaking of graphs in general, always begin with a question, something you want to know. And quite often it answers the question, how many? In fact, most often it answers the question, how many? So in this fictional bar graph, I'm going to ask the question, first of all, I'm going to invent a daughter. I'm going to call her Lucia, my pretend daughter, and I'm going to ask her, how many of each article of clothing do you have? And why did I choose that one? Because often when you do graphs, you have to go out and collect information from many people. This is one where you could do right in your home without having to go through that. And it's a good way to get your child started. It's simpler, not that complicated, more direct. It may not be the most interesting graph there is for her, but this will give him or her a start, and then you can go out and do the kinds of graphs where you have to collect, he or she has to collect information from many people. So this is a good place to start. So let me bring this in right now. I'm going to move this out of the way, and I'm going to work on the big graph paper, of course, so you can see it. It's very easy for you to see. And I'm going to bring this in, and this is what I call a list. And here's what I and Lucia have done. We made a list called Lucia's Clothes, because that's the information we're looking for. So I got a clipboard ready, and we made this nice little list, or some people might even call it a table, and it's called Lucia's Clothes. And as you can see, there's a column for quantity and description. So we went into Lucia's bedroom and looked exactly what kind of clothing she had and how many. So, for example, we found that she had 8 shirts, 7 pants, 10 pieces of underwear, 3 coats, and on through 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 fairly common items. And like I said, this is a great way to get started. It's something you can do right there in your home fairly quickly and easily, but yet it has all the qualities of a graph where you're trying to find out information. So, and of course there are other ones you could use, but we will use or other questions you might ask, but this is where we're going to start. All right. So the first thing we want to do, I'm going to put Lucia's clothes off to the side here, that information. And a graph always starts out, most graphs always start out by what we call laying out coordinate lines, a horizontal and a vertical line. And I will explain this shortly, but I'm going to start out. And I've kind of made little dots to get my bearings here, because that makes it a little easier for me. We're going to take a line straight down there. And then we're going to come over here. And do this horizontal line. So these will be the coordinate lines that we'll be working with as we take the information from our list, our table, our notes, whatever you'd like to call them, and transfer them to a very visual graph. So as you can see, I've now labeled the columns and the rows in this graph, and let's talk about that a little bit. Here on what I call the horizontal line, or the horizontal axis, I'm calling this articles of clothing, and I'm taking this from right off the list we made. And here is shirts, pants, underwear, just like the list, coats, socks, shoes, dresses, raincoat. And actually, this, if your child is moving right along as a reader, this is a great exercise for them to be able to read these words. However, if your child is having trouble reading these words at this point, you may want to put on what I call an icon instead of the print. In other words, instead of writing shirts, you might want to make a little drawing of a shirt and a little drawing of a pair of pants, and on and on and on here, which will make it a lot easier for them to work on the graph. It's up to you. You know your child. So this axis, if you want to call it that, this horizontal line is called articles of clothing, and the vertical line or axis we have here, as you can see, if you can read sideways, is called number of articles. So, and as you can see, they're numbered from 0 all the way up to 12. So let's actually get this graph going then. One more thing I want to tell you. Well, maybe I'll tell you that in just a minute here. Let's get this graph going, and I'm going to look, and we're going to start out with our column called shirts, and I'm looking at my list over here, the list that we call Lucia's clothes, and it says Lucia has 8 shirts. So I'm going to pick, let's see, what color will I use? I could keep just using black. Maybe I'll try red. And here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to start out like this. There's 1 shirt. There's 2 shirts. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. And there, as you can see, it aligns up perfectly with our number of articles over here, 8. So the height is exactly the same. So we know that that's 8 shirts. And what you can do after that, you can have your child. And of course, to start out with, you might be doing this. And as your child gets the hang of what we're doing, you can switch over and let her do the work and help him or her as needed. But these need to be filled in, and that's not that hard to do. So in other words, you go all the way down here to the bottom, filling them in to create a bar. And another option you have, if you don't want to do it that way, is you can cut out these squares from construction paper and build your bar this way. Let's say we're doing something else in this column. And you could build your bar by gluing on these squares. So you have the option of doing that also. I kind of like using the markers, but that's totally up to you. So if you want to do that, just cut out some squares, and you can glue them onto your graph with a glue stick. And as you can see, I've now entered all the information from our original list here, and enter that information on the graph. Let me just show you that here briefly so you understand what I'm saying. Remember, we started with shirts, then I moved on to pants, and I looked over here, and the quantity of pants were 7. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and there that confirms that bar goes up to 7. And I went to each item and made a bar for each one. And this is how it looks when you're all finished. One thing I didn't mention earlier was that, and I should mention this now. You could easily interchange the number of articles and articles of clothing. In other words, swap swap them so articles of clothing would be up here and numbers down here. The only difference that would make would mean the bars would be coming out sideways. And it doesn't matter, whichever way you want to do it. Whichever way you like it is fine, but I did feel like I forgot to mention that, and I should mention that. Okay, so we have a graph, and it's almost complete, but we need to give this graph a name. And of course, why not just name it what we started out with here on our list, Lucia's clothes. It could be, something like Lucia's wardrobe or something like that. I'm just going to call it Lucia's clothes. All right, and that, of course, is what we call the title of the graph. So now our graph is pretty much complete. It has a title, so we know what we're actually looking for here. We have this axis, the vertical axis, tells us the number of articles, and here are the actual articles of clothing. And as you can see, we build up the bar according to the number of articles each one has. So the graph is complete, and of course, now that it's complete, if it really serves its purpose, we should be able to read the graph for information. So you will be working with your child and teaching him or her how to do this. And, just briefly, you can tell her, pretty much what I've been saying to you here all along, how this axis tells how many, this line tells what the articles are, and in order to read it, for example, if you were to ask him, how many coats do you have? You can show him how to do it. He should go here and find coats, count up the bar, and then look over here to see what number the top of it is at. And yes, he or she has 3 coats. In this case, we're talking about Lucia. Lucia has 3 coats, so that's how you read the graph. But once you're finished, of course, that's not... you can ask those kinds of specific questions, but there's a lot of other questions you can ask too, just to make sure that your child understands this graphing process, why we do it, what the graph tells us, why it's so nice to make a graph, and the answer to that is, of course, is because it's a very nice pictorial way of showing information and then being able to compare the information. So you could ask several questions about this graph to your child and see if he or she can answer them. For example, you could start out with the most basic question: what does this graph tell us? And in Lucia's case, she should be able to say, well, this tells me about all the clothes I have and how many I have of each piece of clothing. And then you could ask more questions. Here's a good one to ask. Of what article did you have the most? And of course, that puts Lucia into a new realm here. She has to study the entire graph and look at the bars. And of course, the longest bar is the article of which she had the most. And she'll look down there and say, well, I had the most pairs of socks. I had 12. And then you could say, well, what article or which article did you have the least? And once again, she will have to compare the height of all these bars and look over here, and she'll say, well, look, I only have 1 raincoat. You could ask a question, do you have more coats than shirts? And in that case, Lucia would have to find coats, shirts, and compare the height of the 2 columns. And of course, she'll look and she'll say, well, look, I have more shirts than I have coats. I have 8 shirts, but I only have 3 coats. And then you could make it even more interesting by asking, well, how many more shirts than coats do you have? And then you're looking at subtraction, which of course is 8 minus 3. So she would have 5 more shirts than coats. And you could also ask, in this case, Lucia, how many articles of clothing do you have all together? So she would have to add up all of the columns. And she could do that on a separate sheet of paper, add the numbers, 8 for shirts, 7 for pants, 10 for underwear, and on and on. And then the two of you can work together to find a way to add all those up. Probably, unless she's doing long column addition, you'll have to find creative ways to do that. And of course, in the earlier lessons, we learned how to do that by just combining numbers into little groups. So anyway, that would be a good thing to do. How many articles of clothing do you have all together, Lucia? And finally, you could ask a more, what's the word I should use, esoteric question. Something like this: if your friend Robert made a graph for his clothes, would it look just like this? And of course she would, hopefully she would say, well, no, because I'm sure he has different, quantities of these kinds of clothes and maybe some different kinds of clothes. So it's not likely at all that his would look exactly like this. So those are the kind of questions you can ask about graphs. And you can come up with your own question. You can use this one, the articles of clothing question, and there are others you could use. But like I said, I like this one. It's a good place to start. And take your time, make the graph with your child, and then ask her questions to make sure she understands the information that is contained in the graph. And I should probably add that once you are finished with the graph, like so many things we do, you can post it on the wall somewhere so your son or daughter could go and look at it and kind of revisit it and maybe ask you more questions about it, or you could ask him or her more questions about it. So post it somewhere where your child can see it nice and low on the wall.